June 30th, my sister decided to make the only correct choices in episode 1 of season 1 of The Walking Dead games, and for that her face will be mutilated further than necessary.
He was planning a school shooting, but before he could get there, he turned the shotgun on his own family, his mother, his 13-year-old sister, his 16-year-old brother, each killed while the town slept, unaware that a nightmare had unfolded behind closed doors, in a quiet Luton flat. 3 lives ended in moments. And that was only the beginning. In a country where the word school shooting still echoes with the haunting memory of Dunblane, the idea of another such horror unfolding on British soil felt distant, almost impossible. Since that tragic day in 1996, the United Kingdom had remained largely untouched by the kind of violence that felt all too familiar across the Atlantic. There had been whispers, failed plots, signs caught just in time, but never the actual act of violence. That line, it seemed, hadn't been crossed again. Not yet. But evil doesn't always begin in a school. It may be growing within the walls of a warm home built by a loving mother. Juliana Prosper knew something about starting over. Born as Juliana Falcon on a fine June day in 1976, her early life unfolded thousands of miles away in Mar del Plata, Argentina, a coastal city where the waves carried ease with hardship. She was the kind of woman who never stopped moving forward, no matter what life hurled her way. When she left her homeland behind and built a new life in England, it wasn't just geography she changed. It was an entire future. She married Ray Prosper, and together they raised 4 children. Her world revolved around them. Juliana wasn't flashy or loud, but she had a quiet strength about her, the kind that carried the weight of being both gentle and fierce at once. By 2024, she was living in a modest flat off Walled's Bank Drive in Luton, caring for 3 of her children. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was steady, familiar, a mother's life, built on routines, small joys, sacrifices that often went unnoticed. And while she held her family together, something was burning beneath the surface, something too dark to see until it was far too late. There was a storm brewing within those walls, in disguise of a boy who seemed too meek to even hit an object in his path. Nicholas Prosper was the kind of boy who didn't just fade into the background, he clung to it. A December child born in 2005, he came into the world quietly and for the most part stayed that way. Diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder early on, he walked through life a few steps apart from everyone else, not always alone, but always slightly removed, as though he were watching the world through a speck only he could see through. In his younger years, he had friends, not many, but enough to keep him anchored. He wasn't a troublemaker, not in the traditional sense. He was geeky, they said, soft-spoken, obsessive about computers, the kind of kid who could disappear into a screen for hours and still not feel like he'd scratched the surface. Teachers remembered him as bright, even promising, but what they couldn't see, or maybe chose not to see, was the slow erosion happening beneath the surface. The way isolation began to calcify into something harder, something darker. By the time he reached his late teens, that gentle geekiness had twisted into something far more unpredictable. He stopped trying to connect. The friend group dissolved. The screen stopped being a sanctuary and became something else entirely. A tunnel with only darkness at the end, only reflections of death, hatred, and perversion. He spiraled down corners of the internet where empathy dies, where violence is glorified and human suffering is cataloged like some kind of collectible. At some point, he was banned from one such site, a morbid database where real death was archived and dissected like entertainment. But even there, even in that graveyard of humanity, Nicholas had crossed a line. He made comments in support of pedophilia, vile and unfiltered, as though empathy had been surgically removed from his vocabulary. He wasn't just watching the darkness, he was absorbing it. He was becoming it. And no one knew just how far that darkness had sunk, how deeply it had planted itself in his bones, how it was growing, feeding, waiting. Because Nicholas Prosper wasn't just withdrawing from the world. He was preparing for war. By the time September's Friday the 13th crept into the calendar, the plan had matured into something monstrous, no longer a passing thought or a twisted fantasy confined to the corners of a screen, but an intention, rehearsed in silence and fed with obsession. Nicholas Prosper had immersed himself so deeply in the world of school shootings that his fascination had eroded whatever boundary there might have been between watching and committing. His mind was absorbed in the details of Sandy Hook, the timelines, the methods, the body count, not from a place of grief or horror, but from an ambition to create something even more devastating, a spectacle of violence that would end with him turning the weapon on himself, leaving behind a trail of bodies and questions that would never quite be answered. His choice of target spoke volumes about his mindset. He didn't pick his old primary school because he had suffered there or because of some open wound from childhood. He picked it because he knew its insides, the security system, the classroom layout, the way the corridors turned, like someone choosing the most familiar battlefield for the most calculated slaughter. There was no emotional trigger, no personal vendetta, only cold strategic advantage. When he tried to acquire a firearm in August, the attempt failed, but rather than derail his plan, the setback only seemed to strengthen his focus. He had already been preparing for over a year, building the idea piece by piece in his mind, layering it with research, false starts, and obsessive planning. A delay didn't shake him. It gave him more time to refine the vision. On 12th September, just hours before he would destroy his family, Nicholas finally secured the weapon. He purchased a double-barreled shotgun and 100 cartridges for £650 from a local dealer using a forged firearms license that mimicked the real thing with disturbing accuracy. He had spent time studying every element of a UK license, the paper's weight, the seals, the placement of the official signatures, and had replicated it with extreme meticulousness. The dealer, though uneasy, believed the documentation to be genuine and notified police, but the warning came too late. The weapon was his. His timeline had locked in. As night took hold and the town around him drifted toward sleep, Nicholas wasn't winding down or hesitating. He was finalizing. His browser history from that night became a window into a mind that had spiraled beyond recognition. Search after search for methods of killing with a shotgun, anatomical specifics, outcomes, the kind of blunt force horror that is usually reserved for war zones and nightmares. Mixed in were searches tied to necrophilia and to the murder of Sarah Everard, as though his appetite for violence was expanding even as the clock ticked toward morning. And then came the video, a final digital confession broadcast from his bedroom into the world. He described himself as a follower of Clementine, a fictional character from the Walking Dead video game series, latching onto her image not for her humanity, but for some twisted, symbolic allegiance that only made sense in his fractured reality. He spoke poison about his sister Giselle, referencing a choice she had made in the game months earlier, a moment so trivial that it might have been laughable had it not been spoken with such vile certainty. He said her face would be mutilated further than necessary, delivering the line with a coldness that felt rehearsed, devoid of any trace of human feeling. Though prosecutors would later argue that this reference was irrelevant to the murders, it felt like a sign that nothing, not even a game played with family, was safe from the rot that had taken hold of his mind. As the hours passed and darkness deepened, Nicholas Prosper stood on the edge of his own carefully constructed horror, armed, ready, and emotionally removed from everything that had once tied him to normalcy. Behind him was the quiet of a flat where his family slept, unaware that the boy they had raised, the brother they had laughed with, the son who once played video games in the next room, was preparing to become a vicious monster. Under the thin veil of early morning silence as the world outside remained unsuspecting, Nicholas Prosper sat alone in his room, watching violent animated pornography, while continuing the same heinous research he had started the day before. It was well past midnight. By 4:32 a.m., he had already test-fired the double-barreled shotgun once into a teddy bear. His plan had been to kill 3 people, his mother and 2 younger siblings, in under 30 seconds. He thought the timing would be tight enough to escape detection by the neighbors. But Juliana woke up early. She wasn't supposed to. She saw her son with the gun. There was panic, there was shouting, and a struggle followed. Prosper attacked her with a knife first, slashing and stabbing her hands and arms as she tried to fight him off. He then shot her in the head, close range, killing her. Her body would later be found sprawled in the hallway. Giselle heard the chaos and got up. She was shot at, the bullet grazing the back of her head. She ran, trying to hide under the dining table. He followed. He shot her in the face. Kyle tried to resist. He grabbed a kitchen knife. He tried to fight. Prosper shot him in the chest from across the room. Then he walked over and stabbed him more than 100 times while Kyle begged him to stop. His lung was punctured. He still got up and ran. He made it to the hallway. Prosper shot him in the head. 7 cartridges were fired. He reloaded at least twice. Neighbors heard it all, the shouting, the fighting, the crashing sounds. One of them walked to the door to complain about the noise. She heard ruffling, a boy groaning, and then a shot. She turned around and ran. The first emergency call came in at 5:29 a.m. CCTV footage, till 4:47, caught Prosper's eerily calm walk out of the flat at 5:33 a.m. Almost 20 minutes later, the police had reached the scene. They entered the flat at around 6. They found Juliana, Giselle, and Kyle. Blood streaks across walls. Bloody handprints. Bloodied knives scattered. A copy of How to Kill Your Family placed on Juliana's body. Nicholas had packed the shotgun and 33 cartridges in a large bag. He started walking towards St. Joseph's primary school, the same one he had attended, the same one he had planned to attack. But the school was still closed. Police activity was increasing. He didn't go through with it. He hid in a nearby wooded area for 2 hours. He shared the video he'd recorded earlier, the one about the Walking Dead. He tossed away 2 mobile phones, hoping to protect a group of pedophiles he had spoken with online. Nicholas also left the shotgun and ammunition in a bush near a playing field. At 7:55 a.m., he walked out from the woods and down Framingham Road. He raised his hand to a passing police car. The officers were returning from the crime scene. They stopped. They saw the blood on his face and arrested him.
You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something today's trial in court. Anything you do say may be given as evidence. What road are we on? Birmingham Road. 426, priority. Birmingham Road, I think we've got the offender.
It's not murder.
Yes, we've got a male here. He's presented himself to us. Can we just get another unit?
It's not murder, he kept repeating. He didn't want to show up. The courtroom was ready. The families were waiting. The hour was set, 10:30 a.m. sharp. But Nicholas Prosper, triple murderer, self-styled executioner, failed school shooter, was refusing to step back into the dock. Not out of fear, not out of remorse, because he simply didn't want to. At 8:45 a.m., word reached the judge. The convict was refusing to appear, and Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb wasn't having it. There would be no sentencing in absentia. He was to be dragged in if necessary. Not for his sake, for the sake of the mother, the sister, the brother, the people whose blood he spilled, for those who had come to see the face of the boy who had torn their lives open. "You do not want to be here," she said from the bench, "but it is not your choice." She had him brought in, and he sat there in silence, staring straight ahead.
Possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, and possession of a bladed article. After arrest, you displayed no signs of agitation or mental distress. You were inappropriately cheerful and engaged the officers in conversation. You asked if the local schools were locked down. You made no comment in interview, but later gave a mental health nurse who was assessing you in custody some further details, including that you had planned for a year to kill 34 people, ending in your own suicide. 30 of them were to be school children aged 4 or 5.
Prosper had always rejected what the world had tried to give him: help, assessments, understanding, structure. His parents and teachers knew something wasn't right. They saw him withdraw. They watched him lose interest in the living and wrap himself in shadows. They had begged for an evaluation, reached out to child mental health services, tried to get him diagnosed for autism spectrum disorder. He refused it all, shut every door, sidelined every attempt. A psychiatrist would finally look into him, but not until after the murders. In the cold clinical light of custody, a diagnosis came: mild ASD traits. A report detailed the hollow space where empathy should have been. It was not just a lack, it was an extreme lack, the kind that echoed through every corner of this case. He wasn't unreachable, but he was uninterested. There were no friendships, no real connections, only deep obsessive spirals about serial killers, about school shootings, about death as a spectacle. The judge laid it bare. These weren't just odd fixations. They weren't just dark corners of the internet. They were what shaped his identity. This boy, who had failed to hold even a thread of ordinary social interaction, had built himself a sanctuary in violence. The internet had opened the floodgates. He waded in freely. Every disturbing image, every cold commentary, every headline soaked in blood, it all fed him. Yes, there was an indirect link between his autism and the way he moved through the world, but as the judge made clear, ASD does not make one violent. It doesn't instruct a person to plan a massacre. It does not teach someone how to craft a fake firearms license. It doesn't guide their hands when they aim a shotgun at their own mother. That was Nicholas. And now, whether he wanted to or not, he had to listen. To the law, to the families, to the judgment, because monsters do not get to vanish quietly. They must be seen, they must be named, and they must sit, shackled in silence, while justice carves its final word. The courtroom was silent when the full story came out in March 2025. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence. They were planned in detail, with a clear goal: to become infamous. Nicholas Prosper murdered his mother, sister, and brother as the first stage of a broader scheme to carry out a mass shooting at St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School. The preparations had been ongoing for months. Prosper picked St. Joseph's because he knew it well. He had studied there, as had his siblings. He searched the school's website for photos of students and teachers and noted the timing of assemblies and classes. Everything was methodical. He chose Friday the 13th deliberately, hoping the date would add weight to his actions. His plan was to kill his family early in the morning, leave home by 8:30 a.m., and arrive at the school during assembly to carry out a mass shooting. Earlier that night, he researched how to use the weapon and searched for disturbing content related to violence, including the murder of Sarah Everard and material connected to necrophilia. Neighbors heard the noise. Some reported shouts, banging, and groaning, followed by what sounded like gunshots. One went to the door to complain but fled after hearing a loud bang. A police call was placed at 5:29 a.m. A chase of cat and mouse followed in what ended up as Nicholas being found with blood of his family on his face and clothes. He was charged with 3 counts of murder. He was also charged with possessing a shotgun and a knife in public, as well as acquiring a shotgun without a certificate. Child abuse images were later discovered on his phone, but no charges were filed for that. When the police found him, Nicholas Prosper stood in black and yellow. It wasn't a random outfit. He had chosen the colors on purpose. This was the look he wanted to be remembered by. The judge sentenced him to life with a minimum term of 49 years. Now, this does not mean that Nicholas will be out in the world in 49 years. A life sentence with a minimum term of this many years means that the person will spend the rest of their life in prison, but they must serve at least 49 years behind bars before they can even ask to be released. After the decided tenure, they can apply for parole, which is a formal request to be let out of prison. However, being eligible for parole does not guarantee release. A special board will review the case to decide whether the person is still a danger to the public. If they believe it is unsafe to let the person out, the person will stay in prison. Even if parole is granted, the person will remain under strict supervision for the rest of their life and can be sent back to prison at any time if they break the rules or commit another crime. Going back to the heinous crime that Nicholas committed, it didn't just shake a courtroom. It sent waves through an entire system that many believed was working just fine. But behind the horror of what Nicholas Prosper did was a quieter, more troubling truth. It had been far too easy for him to get his hands on a gun. Law enforcement knew it, and they weren't subtle about it. They pointed out how shockingly simple it still was for someone to sell a firearm privately. All a person really needed was a certificate, real or fake, and a willing seller, and that was it. No double-checking, no verification, no questions, just a deadly loophole wide open. In response, police and safety officials started calling for changes that felt long overdue. One of their key suggestions was to build a national database for firearm license holders, something clear and central where every certificate could be checked against real records. And not just that, they pushed for a rule that would force sellers to get clearance from the police before selling a weapon, to make sure the buyer had the right paperwork, real ID, and a legitimate reason to own a gun. But the danger wasn't only in how Nicholas got the weapon. It was also in what had been building inside his head long before he pulled the trigger. Officials spoke of an obsession, one rooted in endless hours online, wrapped in disturbing content, soaked in stories of mass murder, brutality, and control. What happened wasn't just a crime, it was a slow-growing sickness that had fed on unfiltered violence found in dark corners of the internet, completely unbothered and unchecked. Those watching this unfold didn't hold back. They saw this as a warning, one that wasn't just about guns or loopholes, but about the growing storm of violent content reaching young people and changing the way they think, feel, and act. And the message from the government was clear. This couldn't be ignored anymore. They promised to act, to make the laws more strict around private gun sales, to close the cracks in background checks, and to do more to protect communities from the kind of thinking that leads to something like this. It wasn't about just one tragedy. It was about making sure no one else walks the same path, with a weapon in their hands and a plan built from hate. Even after the government of UK has promised change, it takes time, and time is something we can no longer afford to waste. The next Nicholas Prosper may already be watching, waiting, learning, just as quietly, just as patiently, and as the world spins forward, more connected and exposed than ever, the real question lingers in the quiet. What happens when the next warning sign goes unnoticed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you have made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you will enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.